Um, okay, so picture the scene for a second. It is late 1975,
Right.
and the tabletop gaming world is just absolutely buzzing because Supplement I, Greyhawk, has just dropped.
And it was a massive hit.
Huge hit. It basically took those really loose, kind of confusing rules from the original Dungeons and Dragons box set and, codified them. It made it the game everyone was actually playing.
But the fans, they wanted more.
Exactly. Now everyone is clamoring for the secrets of the other guy.
Dave Arneson,
Yeah.
the co-creator of the whole thing.
Right, because everyone knows Gary Gygax and Greyhawk, but the true genesis point of the hobby-like, where role-playing actually started, was Dave Arneson's Blackmoor campaign.
It was the legendary setting.
And finally, TSR announces they're releasing Supplement 2, Blackmoor. The anticipation for this thing is just through the roof. People think this is going to be the Rosetta Stone, the book that reveals the hidden history of the entire game.
Yeah, but instead...
Instead, we get today's topic.
Right. What they actually got is arguably one of the most chaotic, controversial, and accidentally brilliant disasters in the history of tabletop publishing.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. I am your host, and I'm joined, as always, by our resident tabletop historian to unpack this whole mess. And disaster is a pretty strong word for a book that is technically considered a classic today.
I mean, it really is the only word that fits the actual production history. If you look at how this book was made, it's just a complete mess.
Oh, yeah.
It involves a literal peach basket full of loose notes, a laundry mishap, and a really rushed editorial process that, well, it arguably broke the relationship between the game's creators forever.
Which is tragic, but also fascinating.
But the key insight for our deep dive today, the thing I want you to really grasp, is that this disaster is exactly what the hobby needed.
Because it essentially forced players to fix the game themselves.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It inadvertently taught an entire generation of players that the official rules were kind of broken.
So they had to get creative.
Exactly. It validated the whole homebrew culture way before homebrew was even a term people used.
Okay, so our mission today is to unpack Supplement 2, Blackmoor. We're going to look at how a book that failed to even describe its own setting somehow managed to introduce assassins, monks, underwater combat, and
Sci-fi cyborgs?
cyborgs into a medieval fantasy game.
Cyborgs, aliens, technomancy. It really cemented that gonzo spirit of early D&D.
Let's start with the manuscript itself, or I guess the lack of a manuscript, because the legend goes that Arneson didn't exactly send a neatly typed draft over to Lake Geneva.
No, not at all. You have to understand the dynamic here first. Arneson is up in the Twin Cities running his game, and Gygax is down in Lake Geneva running the company, TSR.
They're already kind of drifting apart creatively at this point.
Very much so. So Arneson submits his quote-unquote manuscript for the book in the spring or summer of '75. But it is not a manuscript in any traditional, publishable sense.
It was literally a basket.
A peach basket.
I always picture like a nice wicker laundry hamper when I hear this story, but it was for fruit.
Just a cheap woven basket. And it was filled with about 50 to 60 handwritten pages.
Just loose.
Loose notes, repetitive charts, and maps that totally contradicted each other.
He just mailed a basket of scraps to his publisher. That feels incredibly bold.
Or just incredibly disorganized.
Yeah.
Depends on how you want to look at it. And the poor guy who had to deal with this was Tim Kask.
TSR's very first full-time employee.
He had just been hired.
Yeah.
And his very first assignment is essentially, hey, here's a basket of absolute chaos. You have 6 weeks to turn it into a sellable product.
6 weeks. That is an impossible deadline to write a coherent book from scratch, let alone translating someone else's chaotic mental notes.
And it gets so much worse. There is this famous, almost comical detail about the whole process.
His laundry incident.
Yes. Kask is trying to work through this pile, right? He's organizing it on the floor, trying to decode Arneson's genius. But he actually had to surrender the physical peach basket.
Because Gary Gygax's wife needed it back.
She needed it to do the household laundry.
That really just paints the perfect picture of TSR at the time. We think of D&D as this massive corporate juggernaut today, but back then, this was a true garage startup.
It was literally a basement operation. The absolute repository of the most legendary campaign history in gaming had to be dumped onto the floor so the Gygax family could wash their clothes.
It's amazing.
But that incident is symbolic of the bigger problem here. The basket wasn't just a mess. It was completely incomplete.
Because Arneson's game wasn't really written down. It was more of an oral tradition at his table.
Exactly. Arneson used a living adjudication style. He didn't have a hard rule for every single thing that could happen.
He was the computer.
Right. If you want to do something crazy, he'd think about it for a second and just say, okay, roll 2 six-sided dice.
Which works beautifully at a table if you have a genius referee running the game.
But it is completely impossible to print as a standardized rulebook for strangers to buy and use.
Cask actually estimated that less than half of the material in that basket was usable in any way. So if the basket was half empty, who actually wrote the book we got?
Cask and Gygax did. Cask later claimed that he basically wrote or completely re-engineered about 65 to 70% of the book himself.
Wow.
And this leads to the great irony of Supplement 2. It's called Blackmoor. It's named after Dave Arneson's famous world.
But if you bought it hoping to get, like, a map of Blackmoor,
Or the history of the campaign, or the lore.
you got absolutely nothing.
Virtually nothing. You got a toolkit of random rules that Cask and Gygax desperately slapped together just to fill the page count.
It's kind of like buying a travel guide to Paris and opening it up to find it's just a manual on how to fix a bicycle.
That is a perfect analogy.
Why?
And speaking of filling the page count, this brings us to one of the weirdest pivots in the entire book.
The water rules?
All right. We're talking about Blackmoor, which is supposed to be this grim, northern, swampy setting. Think of the North in Game of Thrones.
Cold, miserable, muddy.
But a huge chunk of this book is dedicated to scuba diving.
The aquatic patch. This is just a perfect example of their desperation, right? Cask had excised so much of Arneson's unusable stuff that the book was physically too short to send to the printer.
They desperately needed more pages.
So they went straight to the slush pile.
They really did. There was this fan down in Texas named Steve Marsh, a really creative guy who had been sending unsolicited rules to Gygax in the mail.
Just for fun.
Yeah, and he had written this massive, detailed framework for underwater adventures.
And TSR just pasted it in?
Wholesale. Because if you look at the original D&D box set, it completely ignored water. It was all dungeons and wilderness.
If you fell into the ocean, the rules basically just stopped.
Exactly. Marsh provided the fourth dimension of gameplay.
So, just because Dave Arneson's notes were illegible, a book about a freezing northern fiefdom became the game's definitive guide for deep-sea combat.
That's publishing in the 70s for you. But we shouldn't undersell what Marsh contributed here. He didn't just add mechanics for swimming, he added the Sahuagin.
The Sea Devils, those are iconic monsters.
But look at how he added them. This is important. Before this, monsters were mostly just a block of stats.
You kick open a door, there's an orc, you roll to hit it.
Right. But the entry for the Sahuagin was totally unprecedented. It had 2 full pages of ecological and sociological detail.
He actually made them a functioning society.
They had leaders, a strict hierarchy, a real culture.
That's a massive shift for the game. It moves the whole hobby from just kill the monster and take its stuff to actually understanding the world you're exploring. It feels like the true beginning of lore-heavy gaming.
It really does.
Yeah.
And he didn't stop there. He also introduced the Ixixitchitl.
Oh, boy. The evil manta rays. I always struggle to pronounce that one. Ixixitchitl.
Close enough. It's a total mouthful. And here's a really fun fact about that name that Steve Marsh admitted later on. He was a bit of a magpie with his creative influences.
Where did it come from?
The name actually came from a Mormon pamphlet called Christ in the Americas that was discussing Aztec history.
Wait, are you serious? The name of a classic, terrifying D&D monster was pulled from a religious pamphlet.
Hey, it was the 70s. You took your inspiration wherever you could find it.
That is amazing. But beyond the monsters, Marsh had to introduce new physics, right? Because fighting underwater isn't anything like fighting on land.
He introduced very strict rules for swimming encumbrance, like exactly how much gold you could carry in your pockets before you just sank to the bottom and drowned.
Which is very important for greedy adventurers.
And he fundamentally changed weapon efficacy. If you think about it physically, swinging a heavy mace underwater is basically useless because of the water drag.
It's like trying to punch in slow motion.
Yeah.
There's no impact.
Exactly. So the new rules explicitly stated that slashing and bludgeoning weapons failed underwater.
But thrusting weapons worked normally.
Right. Spears, tridents, daggers, those are fine.
That makes total sense from a physics standpoint. But man, that must have been brutal for the players. You know, you play a paladin with a magical holy sword, and you get underwater and the DM says, "Too bad, here's a butter knife."
Which is exactly why they had to patch that patch with specific magic items. They introduced the Ring of Freedom, which magically negated water drag so you could swing your sword.
And the trident of fish control.
The Trident of Fish
And
Control.
not monster control, fish control.
Look, sometimes you just really need to command a school of tuna to create a distraction. Don't knock it.
Fair enough. Okay, so we have this weird Frankenstein of a book taking shape. Half of it is Arneson's confused notes from the Peach Basket, and the other half is Steve Marsh's unsolicited underwater world.
But Kask and Gygax still needed even more content to fill the page count.
And this is where we get into some of the most controversial additions to the entire game, the new character classes.
The assassin and the monk.
Let's start with the assassin,
Yeah.
because this was the very first explicitly evil class you could play, right?
It was. And the controversy wasn't just coming from worried parents outside the hobby. It was completely internal. Gary Gygax and Tim Kask actually hated the idea.
Really? They thought it was bad for the game.
They thought a class purely dedicated to murder and betrayal would just ruin the cooperative spirit of a party.
So why include it at all? If the creators hated it, who pushed for it to be in the book?
Brian Bloom, he was the other co-owner of TSR at the time, he strongly argued that the game was just so lethal back then, the players really needed a mechanical edge.
And honestly, looking at the rules, the assassin was an absolute powerhouse.
Oh, totally. They could use every single weapon, they could use shields, and they had the infamous assassination table.
This is the mechanic where you can just instant kill someone, right?
If you catch them by surprise. It bypassed hit points entirely.
Wow.
It didn't matter if the enemy was a 20th level wizard or a king. If the percentile dice rolled right, they were just dead.
But my absolute favorite part of the assassin rules is the poison mechanic. Poison feels so key for that fantasy archetype.
Definitely. But since there was no alchemist class yet, assassins had to brew their own poisons. And the book added a massive, massive risk to using it.
What was it?
There was a 50% chance, every single round, that if you had a poisoned weapon drawn, someone nearby, a city guard, a random civilian, would notice the smell or the look of it and start screaming for help.
50% per round. That is statistically guaranteed to happen in even a short fight. You basically can't pull a poison dagger in a crowd without causing a riot.
It made playing an assassin incredibly stressful. You were powerful, sure, but you were a complete pariah in society.
High risk, high reward. But the coolest thing to me about the assassin and the monk, too, was the level titles.
Yes.
This is something modern games have mostly lost. In modern games, you just hit level 14, your number goes up, and you get a new power.
But in Blackmoor, your level title actually meant something physical in the world. To become the Guild Master of Assassins, which was the official title for reaching 14th level.
You couldn't just grind enough experience points.
No, you had to physically find the existing non-player character who was the Guildmaster, and you had to murder them.
Talk about a hostile corporate takeover.
It implied that there was literally only one Guildmaster in the whole world. It tied your character progression directly to the world building. You weren't just getting stronger abstractly, you were taking someone's job by force.
I noticed when reading the sources that one of the lower-level titles for the assassin was dacoit. That sounded really unusual for a European fantasy setting.
Yeah, that's another interesting historical pull. It's from Indian history, referring to armed bandits. Before Gygax later standardized everything to strictly European medieval terms, the influences were so much more global and eclectic.
And speaking of eclectic, we have the monk, which just feels completely out of place in a game about knights and wizards.
The monk is pure 1970s pop culture bleeding into the game. It was championed by Brian Bloom again. He was watching the TV show Kung Fu with David Carradine, and he was reading the Destroyer pulp novels.
Specifically the Sinanju martial arts style from those books.
Exactly. He wanted to bring martial arts into the dungeon.
And let me guess, Tim Kask loathed this idea too.
Kask hated it with a passion. He thought it completely broke the genre aversion. But it got in anyway, and it introduced some genuinely wild abilities, like the quivering palm.
The classic delayed death touch.
Yes, you strike someone, and you can just will them to die days or even weeks later.
Yeah.
Very cinematic stuff.
But they also had thieving skills, and strangely, they had the ability to speak with animals.
A martial artist ninja who talks to squirrels.
It was a very odd mix of powers.
Very odd. But, just like the assassin, the monk had that ritual combat advancement. If you wanted to advance to the master levels, you had to find the monk who held that specific title and defeat them in single combat.
And the text actually says you are guided to them by a mystical compulsion. You can't avoid the fight.
It's very much like Highlander. There can be only one.
Precisely. And this is a really key takeaway for anyone studying the history of the game. Blackmoor was actively showing players that this game didn't have to be just Tolkien.
It didn't have to be just Lord of the Rings. It could be Kung Fu theater. It could be a gritty spy thriller with poison.
And as we're about to see, it could literally be Star Trek.
Ah, yes. the gonzo turn.
Because we've got scuba divers, we've got assassins, we've got kung fu monks, but the absolute centerpiece of the book, the adventure module called the Temple of the Frog, just goes completely off the rails.
The Temple of the Frog is historically significant all on its own because it is the first ever published RPG adventure module. Ever. Before this, dungeon masters just made up their own dungeons on graph paper.
And for their grand debut, their first published adventure, they didn't go with the Dragon's Cave. They didn't go with a goblin camp. They went with aliens.
They went full, unapologetic science fiction. This module completely bent the genre. You have players walking in expecting wizards and trolls, and instead, they find a villain named Saint Stephen.
Saint Stephen, which sounds like a very normal medieval priest.
He's definitely not a priest. In the deep lore, he's Stephen the Rock. He's an intelligent, humanoid alien.
Oh, boy.
He was part of a scientific expedition that crashed their spaceship on the world of Blackmoor.
So the big bad guy of the first official fantasy module is a stranded astronaut.
A stranded astronaut with highly advanced knowledge of genetics. He finds this local, primitive human cult called the Brothers of the Swamp, who absolutely hate regular humanity.
And he uses his futuristic technology to accelerate their breeding program,
creating these massive, mutated killer frogs to act as an army.
That is just wild.
I think it's wilder. The dungeon itself has working medical bays. It has an interstellar communications device. And St. Stephen has a personal guard of actual cyborgs.
Cyborgs in 1975 fantasy.
The text specifically describes them as tank-grown flesh over duralloy skeletons with computer chips in their brains.
That is just incredible. Imagine being a player back then, walking into this room with your chainmail and your broadsword expecting an orc, and you run into a literal Terminator.
That was the pure Arneson influence right there. He simply didn't care about genre boundaries. If an idea was cool, it went in the game. And you see this exact same energy with the Egg of Coot.
Okay, I have to ask you about the Egg of Coot, because I've heard the name tossed around in old forms, but I never actually knew what it was.
It is ridiculous, and it is genuinely terrifying. The Egg of Coot is the overarching antagonist of the entire Blackmoor setting.
What is it?
It's a massive, immobile ball of mossy flesh, completely covered in eyeballs and mouths, and it lives deep underground.
That is incredibly gross.
And it uses technomancy. It literally builds futuristic war machines. The text specifically mentions things like the Juggernaut of Doom, which is this massive tank that just grinds people up on the battlefield.
Wait, tanks?
And Wraith Blades, which are swords that have advanced vampiric regeneration protocols built into them.
So Arneson was basically running a post-apocalyptic sci-fi horror campaign and just disguising it as fantasy.
That's a really great way to put it. And that's exactly what Supplement 2 codified for the public. It told players out loud, hey, you can mix lasers and swords. It's totally allowed.
But here's the real catch with all of this. As cool as everything we just talked about sounds, the historical sources make it very clear that this adventure was actually kind of unplayable.
Oh, it was a total disaster to try and run at a table. And this goes all the way back to the core difference between Dave Arneson's home table and the published D&D rules.
Because Temple of the Frog was originally designed for a war game.
Not a dungeon crawl.
Explain the difference in scale for me, for people who might not know.
Sure. In a miniature war game, like Chainmail, you are commanding entire armies. One plastic set on the table might equal 20 or 50 guys.
Right.
But in Dungeons & Dragons, you are playing 4 individual guys walking down a narrow hallway.
And the adventure didn't adjust for that scale.
Not at all. So in the module, you'd kick open a door to a barracks, and the text literally says there are 250 heavily armed men in the room.
250 enemies in one room.
Or you'd find a breeding pool with 1,000 killer frogs.
In a role-playing game, that isn't an encounter. That is a meat grinder.
It's a total party kill in round 1. Early players actually called it a Monty Hall dungeon-like, the game show host, because there was way too much treasure and just a mathematically impossible number of monsters.
It simply didn't work with the standard rules they had just published.
Exactly. It required a dungeon master to frantically adjust the numbers on the fly so their friends didn't instantly die, which, ironically, is what trained that whole generation of DMs to become amateur game designers.
And speaking of mechanics that absolutely did not work, we have to talk about the hit location system.
The spreadsheet of doom.
This is by far the most complex mechanic in the entire book, right?
By far.
Yeah.
Arneson didn't like abstract hit points. He wanted gritty realism. So he designed this system where every single creature's body was divided into strict percentages.
Like the head was 15% of your total body, the chest was 50%, and so on. Okay, I can actually see the appeal of that for a certain type of player, being able to say, I aim my bow specifically for the head.
Sure, it sounds cool in theory, but then you had to use the matrix,
But major.
a literal, massive printed grid you had to consult every time you attacked. You had to cross-reference the attacker's exact height against the defender's exact height.
Oh, no.
So if a 3-foot halfling attacks a 12-foot giant, you look at the matrix, and it dictates that the halfling can mathematically only ever hit the giant's shins.
So the halfling player's just down there round after round, hacking away at ankles.
Exactly. And a knight swinging down from a horse at a goblin could only legally hit the head or the shoulders.
It sounds exhausting.
It required you to do complex fraction math for every single sword swing at the table. You'd say, okay, I did 8 damage, 15% of that goes to the left arm. But wait, the left arm has its own separate armor class because of the shield.
I can completely see why that didn't catch on. It would slow a fast-paced game down to an absolute crawl.
Everyone ignored it. Even Arneson admitted later that he barely used it at his own table, except for maybe really big, dramatic boss fights.
Yeah.
It was just way too much math.
So let's look at the final scorecard here for this deep dive. We have a book that is structurally a complete mess.
Yes,
It has a misleading title that doesn't actually describe the setting you're buying it for.
true.
It features unplayable, scaled-up adventures with way too many frogs. It has math-heavy rules that nobody wanted to use. And the whole thing was pieced together from a laundry basket and some fan mail from Texas.
It really sounds terrible when you list it out like that.
And yet here we are, we're still talking about it 50 years later. It is widely considered a classic of the genre. Why?
Because of the permission it gave.
Permission.
Yes, despite the mess, or maybe entirely because of the mess, Blackmoor proved once and for all that D&D was a tinker's game.
What do you mean by that?
Think about it. If the official published rulebook is completely full of holes, or if it openly gives you rules for cyborgs right next to the rules for knights on horseback, it destroys the entire concept of canon.
Right. It takes away the idea that there's one right way to play.
Exactly. It showed players that the rules weren't commandments carved in stone. They were just suggestions.
You could add kung fu if you wanted. You could add scuba diving. You could add lasers and aliens.
It validated the idea that every single table's version of D&D could be completely unique. And the old school Renaissance movement today, the OSR, they absolutely revere this book because it's so raw and purely imaginative.
It's not some polished corporate product that holds your hand and tells you exactly how to have fun.
No, it's a box of extremely dangerous tools, and it tells you to go build something crazy.
It really makes you wonder about the alternate history of the hobby, doesn't it?
That is the big question for me. If Tim Kask hadn't been forced to filter that chaotic peach basket.
If he hadn't spent those 6 weeks forcing Arneson's wild improvisational ideas into a commercial printed structure,
Would D&D have ever become a rigid structured system at all?
or would it have just remained this loose folk tradition? You know, just a bunch of friends telling stories in basements, passing down the oral history of how to kill a dragon, almost like urban legends.
With no formal rulebooks ever taking hold. It's entirely possible. Kask saved the game by making it printable, but he also fundamentally changed it from the free-form magic Arneson was originally doing.
And Blackmoor is the artifact of that exact transition. Well, thank goodness for the peach basket, and honestly, thank goodness for the laundry that forced them to empty it out.
Watch out for the frogs.
Always. That's all the time we have for this deep dive into Supplement 2. Keep tinkering with your games, and we'll see you next time.